with patterns and brushes that you make yourself. And in week one, some groups or some students in some groups found patterns and brushes already part of Adobe Illustrator. And that is, in fact, true. Under your swatches palette, there will be a couple of sample patterns. So I can select, well, let's just draw a little rectangle that's a little bit bigger. And I can fill it with, oops, I filled the frame, not the inside. Let's try that again. Or we could just flip those now that we have that. So there's a pattern that comes with Illustrator, and it happens to be foliage. And I think Illustrator just puts a couple of these in the palette so you know, so you discover them. But as with all things Illustrator, there's often more hidden. If you go to your hamburger drop-down menu, we can open a swatch library, and one of them is patterns. And there's not a whole lot of them in there, but there are a few. So we could say basic graphic dots, and it comes up, and we can, instead of filling that with foliage, we could fill it with dots or anything else we want. But you can also make your own patterns, and the same is true of brushes. As we've seen, you can apply a stroke to any object, and this box has a little bit of a stroke around it. But if you scroll down, you can also find a few examples of brushes. Let's just make that a little bit bigger so it's easier to see. And this one is designed to look sort of like a natural organic brush shape. But as with patterns, there's a whole lot more that you can access. So you can go to my brush drop-down menu, and I could say open brush library, and there's a bunch of brushes down here. So let's just try bristle brushes. I think I didn't quite get it. Let's try that again. Looking on my small screen. Anyway, they're there, and they work like patterns. You could call them up. But you can also make your own brushes. So we're going to make some brushes today, and we're going to focus on two kinds. One is called the scatter brush, and the other is the art brush. Let me delete this box. And let's just call up, and let's just choose new brush. And it gives you a bunch of choices. In this case, some of them are grayed because we don't have anything selected. These are the brushes that you can open up, and you can just sort of program the behavior of that brush with sliders or by entering numbers. And these don't require you to start anything, but a lot of brushes, especially more complex or fancier brushes, require you to start with a vector or with a other piece of art like a scan or something, and I'll be working with both of those. So I'm going to cancel out because the kind of brushes I'm focusing on are selected. So I've got here a square, just a circle, another square turned on its side, and I can make a brush with this, selecting that, and I can say, let's say new brush, and I'm going to select pattern brush, and you can see a preview of this, and it basically takes this thing and says it's a pattern, and it repeats it over and over and over again. But and pattern brushes sometimes get a little bit distorted in how they approach this, and sometimes there's a gap. So I usually prefer, I have made pattern brushes, but I usually prefer to make a art brush. So I'm going to cancel out of this. But the trouble with the art brush is, however much of this I have, the art brush is going to stretch it however long it has to go. And so if I want a lot of circles and squares and not just one, I have to repeat this brush. So what I'm going to do is I'm first going to use, now I'm just going to select it all. I'm going to hold down my Option key and just drag it. And that makes a copy. And let's just get this guy out of the way. So I obviously dragged it a little bit crooked. So I am going to use my Pathfinder, and I'm just going to line these up down the center. And I think I'm also going to use my Pathfinder and just meld these into one shape. So with this selected, I'm going to say New Brush. And this time I'm going to select Art Brush. And here's the menu I get. And it's showing me a direction for the brush. And Illustrator usually does a good job of guessing the direction I want it to go. I mean, in this case, I don't care whether it goes left or right, but I could change it the other direction if I want it. I could also change it this way. That would make for a very strange, funny looking brush, because I really want this texture along the edge is what I want my brush to display. And I'm going to say OK. And I just made a little practice one earlier today. So here is my second version that I made. And I can then just draw with my pen tool a shape, just a path. Okay, because my last thing was flip my fill and stroke just by hitting this little arrow next to those swatches. And now I can apply my new brush to it. And there it is. And it can be as complex or as simple as you want it to be. And I can also apply this brush, and I've done this occasionally as a designer, to get a grungier look on my type. So I can take this type and I can give it a stroke. Oh, it already has a stroke. And I can apply the brush to that, except I can't. And the reason is you cannot apply any kind of funny stroke to live text. You have to find you have to convert it to outlines first, so that it's essentially the same as anything else you draw in Illustrator. Now, when I convert type to outlines, what I always do is, or almost always, I always do if I'm thinking smart, is I drag a copy of it off onto the pasteboard where it'll be out of the way. And the reason I do that is just in case later on that type changes, or I find a mistake in the type, anything like that, then I could go back to the live type. Because once I convert this to outlines, it is no longer going to be editable as letters. I won't be able to stick my cursor in it as I can now and just say, change it. Once it's outlined, it's pretty much frozen. So I'm going to go to my type menu, and I'm going to say create outlines. And now I can no longer edit this text. I think I did it with I had the other one selected too, unfortunately, but I'm not going to bother to undo that. But we can click this, and we can now see the type's individual anchor points. And these points were always there. You just didn't have access to them as an Illustrator user. But once you've converted it, you have access to the lines. So this is something you might do if you were creating a custom logo or a special type treatment. You might convert your type to outline so you can manipulate the individual shapes of each letter. So now that I've done this, I can now take all this type and apply that stroke to it. And actually, I kind of like that. It looks a little bit funky, but it's also a little bit big. And you'll note that as with any line, every stroke in Illustrator comes with a width, and the default is 1 point. Now, obviously, this stroke is much wider than a literal point, but that's what comes in by default, and 1 point means in Illustrator language that is the stroke as you entered it into the system when you created it. But I don't have to stick with that. I can change it to 0.5, and then I'm getting a little bit sense of my counter and the P and the E, and I think that's a more successful look for this particular word. So that's kind of a fun thing that can be done with type. And I could do the same thing with this. I could also make that a little bit narrower. Now, one thing you might want to do is change the color of your stroke. And so let's make sure I have my stroke in the front and my fill in the back so that my stroke is selected. And I can say CMYK red, make that a red stroke. Let's make it actually a cyan stroke. And nothing happens. And that's because when you make the stroke, you have to program that ability into it. And I forgot to do that. So I'm going to double click on this stroke. And for colorization method, the default is none. That just means that it's accepting the color of the vector as you created it. And by the way, the vector didn't have to be a single color. It could have been, I could have made those squares and circles alternating colors, or done anything what I want it with them. But in this case, I want to be able to change the color. So I'm going to change its method of colorization to hue shift. And I don't know why you would ever do anything other than this. Hue shift basically lets you do whatever you want with it. So I'm going to say OK. And I'll say apply to stroke. It's Illustrator is warning me, do you really want to do it to what you did already? And the answer is yes. And now it is blue, or it could be green. Or it could be red, or anything else I want to make it. And the same is true of the type. I can make that now, because the same thing happened to that. I can make that now any color I want. Now, a stroke, an art brush, can be something besides a vector. It can actually be an image you brought in, and this is just something I brought in from Photoshop. It happens to have a transparent background, so that, let me just bring that to the front using the key command, so I could see a little bit of a sense of what is going on underneath. Let me just, you can just see a little bit of that shape I made. When I based the stroke on, you can see a little bit of it through this. And it doesn't have to be transparent, but if it had a white background, that you would see that too, because everything you bring in comes in with this stroke. And to save it with a transparent background, I just saved it as a Adobe Photoshop document on one layer with the transparency. But it could be another format that supports transparency. So I am going to take this and I'm going to say new brush again. And I'm going to say art brush. And it doesn't let me because it has to be embedded in this image. And let me just talk about that for a minute. Whenever you bring one piece of art into a Adobe program from another, there's really two ways to do it. One is you can bring the data into this document so that it's part of it, or two, you can save it as a link back to the original, and the program just sort of refers to it. And when you need to print that document or you need to export that document, the document has to be able to find everything it's linked to for it to look right. So the disadvantage of embedding a piece of art in one thing, and this is going to be true in Photoshop, it's going to be true in InDesign when we get there, is that it makes your file much bigger. And also you, at least temporarily, lose access to some of the qualities that for editing those outside images. And the advantage is you don't lose them, because when you start working, it doesn't really matter so much right now that you're only working in Illustrator, but when you start working in multiple applications, then you have to be able to keep track of not just what's literally in that application, but everything that application refers to. So that is to say that if this was live type, the program would have to be able to go back and find that type. That typeface has to be installed on your computer. And the same is true of this linked file. Is if I were to print this, if I thought this art was done and I were to just send it to my printer or put it on a page or export it for web presentation, I would have to be able to find all that stuff. And if the program couldn't find it because I'd moved it or accidentally thrown it away, I would see just sort of a gray box here rather than this piece of art. So what we're going to do is we're going to embed this piece of art. I'm going to go to Window, Links, and I am going to say Embed Image. And it is now embedded, and my little icon here changed. It had been a chain indicating that it was linked, and now it's indicating that it is part of the image. And I could unembed it by basically doing the reverse of what I just did, but now it's embedded, and now I should be able to make a stroke out of it. So I'm going to say New Brush, and we're going to make it an art brush, and I'm going to say OK. And again, this one's vertical, but InDesign has correctly guessed that it's supposed to go that way rather than the other way. In this case, it is, well, actually, I don't know. Let's just see. I think because it's got multiple colors, I can't give it a hue shift, but we'll give it a try just in case. So now I could apply this stroke to that, or I could just draw out a new stroke. And let's just reverse that and deselect that stroke. And I can apply that. But it will not, I don't think, let me change the color because it's not a vector, it's something I brought in. And so it's possible to get something sort of naturalistic in Photoshop, and it's possible to use this in other ways. So for example, my Facebook display art, whatever they call that, above the little portrait, for a while I had a bunch of kind of dancing, moving water bottles that were sort of interacting with each other. So one other thing about strokes that you should know is it's possible to individually change them. You can give them what's called a width profile. You can't give it to that because that's not a stroke. That's the art I made the stroke on. So I can keep this at uniform, but I could also make it taper in and out so that even though I have one stroke, I could get multiple looks for it. And I can do that with this guy too. Let me just bring that to the front with the key command, and let's just give it a more contrasty color. And let's just try a different one of those. And those are all pre-baked, but you can also make your own with what's called the width tool, and that's this guy here. So I can grab this, make it wide, put an arrow, and keep going. And then I could do the same thing with that path if I wanted to give it a little bit of a more organic look. So I want to show you one more kind of brush, and that's called a scatter brush. And I think I'm going to make just a little bit of a cross for this. So I'm going to use my Pathfinder just to center these, and not my Pathfinder, but my alignment panel. It's up there at the top. Then I will Pathfinder them again. I think this time what I'm going to do is I'm going to divide it. And that just makes a separate shape out of each individual intersection. I'm going to take that middle one and just delete it. So I've got like a little plus with a missing middle. So as with patterns, or unlike patterns, unlike brushes, you can start with a piece of art to make your pattern. I can select this and this will be the basis for my pattern, or you could just start a pattern and build it inside the pattern maker. So I'm going to go to Object, Pattern, Make. And it tells me it's been added to my swatch panel, which is where I'll find it. And when I make a pattern, it shows me a preview of what that pattern will look like. So this is it, but there are various ways to arrange it. So I could do it bricks, which I think is probably a little bit nicer for this pattern, or I could do it as hexagrams, or I could do it as brick by column. I think I'm going to do one of the bricks. And I think I also I like that there's a little bit of distance, but I don't like that these are all connecting up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to unlock my size command. I'm just going to do this. And then under my height, I'm going to make it a little bit bigger and get some separation between those pluses. So that's that. And maybe it's too simple for me, so maybe I'm going to just add a little square to it. So I'm going to select a color, go over to my square tool, and just add a little square. Oops, let's reverse those colors again and give it no stroke. So I have a little square. There it is, and not only my original, but you can see all the copies have picked up a little square too. And I could even draw something that connects across the pattern. So I can't do that up and down because I put some space, but I think side to side I could draw something that connects up. Well, sort of. So there's my shape, and you can see it even overlaps a little bit from where it is. Now, something we haven't talked about yet is isolation mode. And I get myself in isolation mode all the time by accident, where you accidentally select one part and Illustrator thinks you want to work on just that one little piece. So you see a grayed out bar like this, and you could just hit the arrow to leave isolation mode, or if I decided I wanted to abandon this pattern, it's just really easy to do that by accident. And if you get yourself in isolation mode, there'll be an arrow and you could just exit. Sometimes I even find myself in double isolation mode, which I find annoying. So now I could say done, or I could say save a copy. Maybe I'm going to pick save a copy. So save a copy is I like this, but I'm going to keep working on it and see what happens. So I tend to give things names. If I think of it, for patterns, I'm usually not making so many that it matters. So I'll just say okay. So I'm going to say okay. The pattern's been successfully added, and let's just add one more little. I say cyan box. So let's make it a circle this time. Oop, didn't get my color. Okay, and so this time I could just say done, and that'll do the same thing. It'll automatically add that pattern to my swatch library. So here we are. Let's make this layer disappear, and let's work on my other layer. And I will make a box. And now, here at the bottom, maybe not that far, I went too far. There they are, new pattern and new pattern 2. And I can apply that and there is my pattern. And there it is without the dot, basically the same thing. Now the other thing to know about patterns is, like brushes, you can make them at one size, but you don't have to keep them that size. But it's a little bit, well, it's not super intuitive for either, but it's a little bit less intuitive for patterns, how you change the pattern. So what I'm going to do is, with this still selected, I'm going to go to my effects panel, drop down, and there's a lot of things here that we just won't have time to get into, but transform is pretty useful, so we're certainly going to get to this one. And in the crit group, some people had found a few of these other things like roughen or pucker and bloat, and those all are pretty easy to teach yourself and can be fun if you're bored to spend some time on those. But we're going to go to transform, and a little bit outside my viewing area, but here it is. And here's a bunch of things we can do to it. We can also use this to make copies of it if we wanted to. In this case, I'm not going to make a copy, but a lot of times you say you have like a little ball and you want to fill up your space with a bunch of squares or circles in a row. You can use this to create a bunch of copies, and that's another way to make a pattern, is with your transform. But in this case, I'm going to scale it so it's smaller. Let's just make it 50%. All right, 52. And you can use your slider. You can also just type into this. And you can also give it an angle. Now there are two things that you can transform when you're working with patterns. One is objects, which I almost never want to do, and the other is patterns, but both of these have a little checkbox next to them. And if I hit my preview button, what I have done is I have transformed both the object and the pattern. But really, I just want to transform the pattern, so I'm going to uncheck object, and now my pattern is a little bit smaller, as we can see. And it's also at a different angle, so I can say OK. And so once you create a pattern, like as with a brush, that's the starting point of what you can do with it. It's not the end point. So the assignment for week 3 is to create yet another collage that uses at least 2 brushes that you have made yourself and 1 pattern that you have made yourself, and just be as aesthetic and exploratory as possible with it. I forgot to do, and that's to demonstrate the scatter brush. I started to make a scatter brush and I ended up making a pattern. So let me turn this layer back on, turn this upper layer off. Ooh, look at that though. And let's go back to this little guy, and I'm gonna, I think, scale him down a little bit. Again, just hold the shift key to scale it a little bit smaller. And I'm gonna go back to my brush palette this time. And I'm going to say new brush. And this time I'm going to select the scatter option and click OK. Pull that on the screen. And you'll see that this gives you a very different sort of interface. And these are always size fixed and spacing fixed and scatter fixed and rotations fixed by default, which I don't know why, because it's a scatter brush. So of course I'm going to want it to scatter. So I'm going to change these to random, all of them. But basically I still have to program in some behavior. So for my plus sign, I don't think I want it any bigger than that size as it is. In fact, let's take its maximum size down to 85 and its minimum down to 20, so that it will range in size from 85% of what you see here to 20%. And for spacing, usually, I mean, you could have a big scatter. You could have a scatter where it goes all over the place. And by the way, I often find that I need to come back and adjust these depending on how they work out. So I just make my best guesses for the first go round. So let me, spacing, and this is all proportional to the size of it. So let's say between 78 and 179. And for the scatter, random, let's have it fairly tight. If you have too loose a scatter, it tends to go all over the place. So let's call that good. And then for rotation, I want it to go all the way from one to the other. So let's just make that big. And again, for colorization, I'm going to say hue shift and click OK. And now this shows up not as a swatch, but in my brushes menu in the top part, unlike where these other brushes appeared, because it's really just one little blop. So I can take my word type and we can select my rotation for it, and we can apply that brush to it. And then we get this sort of scatter thing. And it sort of works in relationship to it. It does not do a very good job defining the edge of this piece of type, though. So that might be a way of I might want to come in, and if I wanted this to define the type itself or the word itself, I would probably want it tighter. When I double clicked on it, what it did was it reapplied, which is sort of a necessary step along the way, although you kind of wish it didn't. So for my scatter, I think my numbers are just too big. Let's just bring this in. And because we have preview selected, you can watch what this does to the brush. So that would be a type that would more likely define, a scatter that would more likely define these words. I could come up with a usable result if that's what I wanted. But it could also be a way of, then it asks if you, like it did with the other, should we apply to the stroke? And let's say apply to stroke. And let's take this and let me get rid of the fill. And we can still see the outline. But if I copy this, I'm going to Command C the copy, or just edit, copy, and then I could say paste in place, just one on top of the other. And let's just make this one a second color. Oops, that. Do that because I had my fill still selected. And this time I'll use the key command for paste in place, which is Command Option Shift V on a Mac. Reapply that so it changes. Give it yet another color. And if you wanted to, you could start to use a scatter to build up something that looks like a shape over time. So that's all I wanted to teach you for this week. I'll enjoy seeing you in our Zoom rooms later on.